Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. Today we're going to go over another form of passive transport, and this one is called osmosis. So we went over diffusion, which is the movement of solutes or substances from high concentration to low concentration directly through the cell membrane, through the phospholipid bilayer. We went over facilitated diffusion, which also went from high to low concentration with no energy required, but this time it did need a protein channel or a carrier protein in order for it to pass through the cell membrane. And this time it's the same thing. But this time it's the diffusion of water. That's the only difference. It's the diffusion of water across a selectively or semi-permeable membrane. So the only difference with osmosis is we're specifically talking about water. We're not talking about ions. We're not talking about glucose. We're not talking about gases like oxygen or CO2. It's specifically water. So, what do you guys think? Is energy required for the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane? What do you think? Is energy required? You are correct. No. Since it's a form of diffusion and it's passive transport, no energy is required for water to move across the cell membrane. Now, I probably don't need to tell you this by now, but water moves with the concentration gradient. Which all that means is water moves from high concentration of water to low concentration of water. And that's with any kind of passive transport, that's always the case. In passive transport, things are always moving with the concentration gradient from high to low concentration. All right, so now that we have kind of an understanding what osmosis sort of is, here's the ocean at Pismo Beach, California. Ocean water contains about 3.5% salt. So it's about 3.5% of ocean water is salt. Over here we have human cheek cells. If you look at them under the microscope, human cheek cells have about 0.9% salt. So the question is, which one of those would have a higher percentage of water? Not salt, but which one would have a higher percentage of water? Ocean water or human cells? See what you think. Well, the answer, of course, is that human cheek cells would have a higher percentage of water because they have a lower percentage of salt. So if these dots over here represent salt, ocean water would have a lot of dots in it. I don't know, they're red, oh well. Ocean water would have a lot of dots, a lot of salt, where human cheek cells would have much fewer salt molecules in it. Therefore, human cheek cells would have a higher percentage of water. So, if we filled up this beaker filled with ocean water, our salt's going to be black this time, and then we place this cheek cell inside that beaker of ocean water, well, first, the ocean water is going to have a lot of salt. The cheek cell that we placed in it is going to have much fewer molecules of salt in it. It's going to have a lower percentage of salt. But since it has less salt, it's going to have a higher percentage of water. And since we know osmosis is passive transport, it goes from high to low concentration, that water is actually going to move out of the cell from a higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. And this solution here would be called hypertonic. And we're going to go over that on the next slide. All right, so now some types of solutions. But before we get to that, remember, a solute is anything that is dissolved within a solvent. Now, all you got to know about a solvent, we're almost always talking about water. So a solute is anything that is dissolved in water. And when you put those both together, like say we're talking about salt, so if you put salt into water, salt is the solute, water is the solvent. The salt water makes a solution. It makes a salt water solution. And those solutions can come in a variety of strengths. You could put a lot of salt in the water, you could put just a tiny bit of salt in the water. And that's what these terms right here are going to be. The first one is called a hypertonic solution. Hypertonic. If somebody says that you are hyper, that means you have a lot of energy. But if you call a solution hypertonic, that means you have a lot of solutes. Or at least you have more solutes than is present inside the cell. So if there are more solutes in the solution than is what is inside the cell, that is going to be hypertonic. Now, since there's more solutes, and we're going to say salt, if there's a high percentage of salt, that means there is a lower percentage of water. So hypertonic means more solutes, but less water. Now, the opposite of that would be hypotonic. A hypotonic solution would contain less solutes than is inside the cell. And since it has less solutes than is inside the cell, it's going to have a higher percentage of water outside the cell than is inside the cell. And the last type of solution is called isotonic. And that has an equal amount of solutes that is present inside the cell. So hypertonic has more solutes outside the cell, but less water. Hypotonic has less solutes, but it'll have a higher percentage of water. And isotonic has an equal amount of solutes outside the cell versus inside the cell. All right, so now some examples. The little dots right here, those are the solutes, and we're going to just say it's salt. This right here is a cell placed within a solution, and this out here is the solution that it's placed in. The question is, would this solution right here in this little beaker that the cell is placed in, would that be hyper, hypo, or isotonic? Let's see what you think. Now, if you remember, hyper means you have a lot of solutes. Hypo means you don't have that many. Now, this solution right here, there are less solutes. There are less dots on the outside versus the inside of the cell. So that this solution right here, that's going to be hypotonic. That's going to be a hypotonic solution because there are more solutes inside the cell versus outside the cell. So obviously, this solution right here, since there's more dots, there's more salt, there's more solutes outside the cell versus inside the cell, this solution here is going to be hypertonic. Now, the question is, which way will water move? Now, in this hypertonic solution, since there's more solutes here inside the cell, there's more solutes, that means there's less water. That means water is going to want to move from high concentration of water to low concentration of water. Since there's more solutes inside the cell, that means there's more water out here outside the cell in the solution. In this case, water is going to want to move into the cell through osmosis. Now over here, it's going to be the opposite. Since there's less solutes inside the cell, that means there's a high concentration of water inside the cell, and there's a lower concentration of water outside the cell, because look at all these dots. There's all these solutes out here. There's all this salt. There's a less percentage of water. So in this case, the water is going to want to move out of the cell towards the salt because there's less water outside the cell. All right, so this slide is going to be very similar to the last slide. We're talking about solutions, and this solution right here. When we're talking about the solution, this solution is hypertonic. So we're not talking about what's inside the cell, we're talking about the solution that's outside the cell. And it's hypertonic because if you're hyper, you have a lot of energy. Now this solution is hypertonic because it has more solutes. You can see all the little dots. It has more solutes outside than there is inside the cell. Now, since there's a lot of solutes out here on the outside, there's a lot of salt. Since there's a high percentage of salt, that means there's a low percentage of water. Inside, since there's a low percentage of salt, that means there's a high percentage of water. And we all know that in diffusion and in osmosis, everything wants to go from high concentration to low concentration. And even though there's a lot of dots outside, that means there's less water outside. So in this case, water is going to want to move from high to low concentration of water. And water will move out of the cell and into the solution. So in a hypertonic solution, which way would water move? As I said, water is going to move out, because there's a high concentration of water inside the cell and there's a lower concentration of water outside the cell. So water is going to want to move out. Now the solutes, the salt, they're going to want to move in. But salt is blocked by the cell membrane, and we're just talking about water here in osmosis. Water is going to want to move out because there's a higher concentration of water inside the cell versus outside the cell, and water is going to want to move from high concentration to low concentration. Now this here would be the opposite. This would be a hypotonic solution. Remember, we're just talking about the solution. We're talking about the solution outside the cell. Now you can see there's a lot of dots. There's a lot of solutes. There's a lot of salt inside the cell. There's fewer solutes, there's fewer salt outside the cell. So that means there's going to be a lower concentration of water inside the cell, high concentration of salt, but lower concentration of water, and a high concentration of water outside the cell. So in this case, water is going to want to move into the cell. In this case, water is going to want to move from high concentration of water to lower concentration of water, and water will move in. Once again, the salt, they're going to also want to move from high to low, but they can't get through the cell membrane because the lipid bilayer blocks them. So salt's going to want to move in the opposite direction, but water is going to want to move from high to low. It's going to want to move in. All right, so a little diagram here of blood cells in a solution. Now you can see in this case, inside the cell there's 85% water. Outside of the cell there's 95% water. And you can see that by looking at the dots. There are more dots inside the cells than there are outside the cells in the solution. So we know that water moves from high concentration of water to low concentration of water. So which direction will the water move in this situation? Is it going to move into the cell or out of the cell? See what you say. Now in this case, since there's more dots, there's more solutes inside the cell versus outside the cell, that means there's a high concentration of water outside the cell, low concentration of solutes, but a high concentration of water. And there's a low concentration of water inside the cell. So in this case, water is going to want to rush into the cells. Water is going to move in. The solutes are going to want to move out, but the water is going to want to move in. So the water is going to want to move in to the cells. So since water is rushing into the cell, will the cell get larger, shrink, or stay the same? In this case, since a bunch of water is rushing in from high to low concentration, the cell will get larger. Now this would be the opposite situation. Inside the cell we have 85% water. Outside the cell we have 72% water. And you can see, look at all the little green dots. There is a high concentration of solutes in the solution outside the cell. That means there is a lower percentage of water. So outside the cell we have a low percentage of water. Inside we have a high percentage of water. So in this case, even though the green dots, the salt, are going to want to move in, the water in this case is going to want to move out of the cell. From high concentration of water to low concentration of water. So water is going to move out of the cells. So is the cell going to get larger, shrink, or stay the same? In this case, you can see those cells, they will shrink. Now this here would be an isotonic solution because there's an equal amount of solutes, the little green dots, the salt, on the outside versus the inside. So since there's the same amount of solutes, there's the same percentage of water. So in both of these we have 85% water. So water still wants to move from high concentration to low concentration, but since there's an equal amount of water on the inside versus the outside, water is going to move in and out equally. Water will still move, but water is going to move in and out of the cells equally. So does the cell get larger, shrink, or stay the same? In this case, the cell will stay the same. And the last slide. Regular bios, this will be extra credit for you guys. Honors, you're going to have to know this, but it's only going to be like one question on your test, so it's no big deal. So can water really go straight through the lipid bilayer, straight through the balloons and strings through simple diffusion? And our slides earlier said yes it could, but I did lie again. Water is actually blocked by the lipid tails. We remember that the nonpolar lipid tails repel water. They're hydrophobic. So water has a very difficult time getting through the cell membrane. But they do have a very special channel, protein channel, called an aquaporin. For people that speak Spanish, agua means water. Aquaporins are special protein channels which allow water to move in and out of the cell. And that's basically all you need to know about that. Now they do repel positively charged ions because the inside of that aquaporin has a positive charge, so ions that have like chloride ions that want to come in, they can't come in. And the water actually has a very specific diameter, so only one water molecule at a time can fit through there. But all you need to know, aquaporins are special protein channels which allow water to move in and out of the cell. And a little review time. The little cloud-like shape thing inside the glass or the beakers, those are the cells, and everything outside the cell is the solution. So we'll see how you do on this review.